Hello and welcome to Future Squared. Stephen Hawking once said that intelligence is the ability to adapt to change, so let's adapt. My name is Steve Glaveski, and each week I'll bring you conversations with preeminent thought leaders from a variety of fields to help you think in a multidisciplinary way, kick goals in your professional and personal life, and better navigate what is fast becoming a brave new world. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation accelerator that works with organizations to unlock their people's latent potential to create more impact for humanity and lead more fulfilling lives. If you need help driving your organization's innovation strategy, visit collectivecampus.io. And without further ado,
come with me if you want to live.
So it's a lot of ripple effects, even if your business is not impacted directly by the crisis. Maybe your suppliers are, maybe your stakeholders are impacted. So we started by describing all the different changes linked to low-touch interactions, but overall it covers all the different changes that are happening in society today.
Welcome to Future Squared for episode number 389 with Nick De Mey. Nick De Mey is founding partner of Board of Innovation, a strategy and business design firm for corporates. He heads up the Insights team and recently published an in-depth report on the low-touch economy and what organizations can do to adapt to the new normal. In this conversation, we unpack 1, how to identify quick wins to weather the storm, 2, how to identify longer-term business model shifts, and 3, what we should really be bracing ourselves for insofar as business recovery is concerned. We touched on that and a whole bunch more. So with that, please welcome Nick De Mey. Welcome to the show, Nick.
Hi, well, nice to hear you.
It's a pleasure to have you joining me on the program all the way over from Antwerp in Belgium.
Yes, correct. Great. So almost exactly the opposite side of the world.
Yes. And the last time I was actually in Antwerp, I was, I think, on a train on my way to the Grasspop music festival in Belgium.
Yes, that's it.
I would have been
nice
about. Yeah. It's listeners of Future Squared will know my love for heavy metal music, and Grasspop is like this 3 or 4 day event. And back then I had hair down to my waist, and really enjoyed I think it was the Jupiler Belgian beer at the time.
Yeah.
Jupiler.
Correct, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, those festivals are not happening this year, of course.
Of course. I mean, there's been a few online festivals that I've attended, but it's not quite the same as a big outdoor event when you have 60 or 70,000 people descending on one place and just having a big party. But I'm sure we'll get back there slowly but surely.
Yeah, indeed. Will be.
Yes, definitely. And this is a topic that you and the team at Board of Innovation have been doing a lot of work on something you've essentially dubbed the low-touch economy. You released a report on this recently called The Gold Rush on the New Normal. For our audience, Nick, how do you define the low-touch economy?
Well, yeah, the low-touch economy, right? We coined the term now a couple of months ago. For us, it's mainly it's a sort of new type of economy or new type of society, even where we're falling back on sort of a lot of low-touch interactions. So that's the most clear identifier of this new era. But of course, it's not just restricted to low-touch interactions, although a lot of business need to take measures and to follow new guidelines. For us, it also covers all the different ripple effects it creates in society. So there are certain ripple effects linked to purely how do you manage the health crisis? So how does behavior change of people? So how do people and consumers, how do consumers and companies interact with each other? That's evolving, and overall it creates a lot of sort of economic disruption now. It's a lot of ripple effects, even if your business is not impacted directly by the crisis. Maybe your suppliers are, maybe your stakeholders are impacted. So we started by describing all the different changes linked to low-touch interactions, but overall it covers all the different changes that are happening in society today. So that's the main research topic at the moment.
Yeah, actually, I laughed when I read something in your report because it struck home for me on the low touch economy. You've got visiting family or visiting vulnerable family members behind glass, and you've got a photo in here of someone visiting their mum or their grandma, I assume, behind glass. And I was doing that with my mum for a couple of months, literally just talking behind the door. It was. Look, it's better than nothing, I suppose. It's better than being on the other side of the world.
Many people switch to sort of an improvised solution for a couple of weeks, but assuming this part of the situation will stay here for a longer time, we now need to evolve to a more structural approach, better services, better ways to interact with each other. All those improvised solutions to visit families, to do weddings, whatever people improvised. Yeah, that was just a very temporary thing, and it's interesting to see now how. Now companies and people are evolving to more sustainable solutions for probably the year or two ahead. So interesting to follow, I think.
Definitely. And with respect to something you touched on there, this being a longer term thing, I had a conversation with Steve Blank on this topic when the outbreak first occurred around what leaders need to do when assessing how long is this thing going to go, and can we survive with our existing business model, or if this is a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year problem, and like you said, it's not just an isolated problem for your company, but there are ripple effects to your customers, your partners, your suppliers, different stakeholders down the line. If it really is a longer term problem, then what changes might you need to make to your business model? Before we even get to that, what do you think in terms of the recovery on this? Because if I look at, say, the global financial crisis, that was about 6 years. The Great Depression was 10. And, this is more of an external shock rather than an internal one. But what are your sentiments, Nick, on the recovery?
Yeah, there are a lot of subtopics here, a lot of things that are coming together to make a good statement. But we've been tracking now the ongoing evolution since early May, since early March, I think. The first steps, the impact, at least when it arrived in Europe, then we were really all in on this. And what you saw was that a lot of companies were really reluctant to make changes to their business models. So most of the time, they just postponed their way of working for a couple of weeks, and they planned new release dates 1 month ahead in time. It took almost, I think, 2 months before most businesses realized, okay, this is probably something here that will be with us at least at the end of the year or something. So they started replanning their programs or product launches or whatever they were doing. And it's only now we're entering, on our part of the world, we're now entering the summer period. So it's sort of a time for reflection. And people start to realize, okay, even in summer now, people assume that it's finally over. Of course, the strict lockdowns are over. But at the same time, you see the first, second waves popping up in different regions. So I think that's the moment that many businesses realize, okay, even we're restarting the economy. It's not the same anymore. We need to calculate certain risk now, or work with a certain risk that we will bounce back quite soon, or maybe that some suppliers of us are impacted, or that we get new restrictions in place. Mm-hmm. So many companies now realize that this is definitely something here for a longer period. And if you listen to the medical experts, probably a year, 2 years until there's a vaccine or something. So it's challenging. So you see that. Some companies are adapting already, and one of our surveys that we did was with, I think we had more than 750 organizations that replied to this, and then we saw a clear split in how small businesses are evolving compared to large corporates or large business. And what you saw that the smaller companies, that probably because they're most impacted, they have less resources and maybe a buffer in place. So many small businesses are already jumping to sort of new business models or looking for adjacent offerings, new products and services, at least experimenting with that. While if you look at the larger corporates, most of them are playing more a defensive game, investing more in protecting the core business, and even moving part of their innovation budget to away from exploring new territory, but moving part of that budget to protecting the core business. So you see there's a split ongoing on between large and small companies. I think the reasons why we still investigate it, there's some patterns there, but our assumption is that most large companies, they have multiple business lines, multiple offerings, they're just focusing on what still works, and they may be waiting it out in the other parts of the business. While a small business, if you're impacted somehow, you don't have that freedom to wait 6 months, maybe till the economy recovers or so. So you already have to move quicker. You have to find new growth options. But it's interesting to see how different players now react to the ongoing changes.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you're right on the small business side. I remember reading a report that found that about 50% of American small businesses said that they couldn't survive 3 months once the pandemic broke without external government assistance. So, yeah, if you're looking down the barrel of a 3-month runway, you're going to do whatever you can to kind of try and find alternative sources of revenue.
Yeah, but if you look at the recovery time, when will we go fully back to normal? I think there was a recent survey a couple of weeks ago that we also looked into in doing our preparation for our own webinars. There was by Fortune, the American publication by Fortune.
Yep.
They asked CEOs of large corporates, and I think 50 or 60% of CEOs already predicted, like for their business, it would take them at least Q1 or Q2 2021, and even 25% or so was even 1 year longer. So many companies are starting to realize this is even a full recovery for their own industry. It will be a year or 2 years in before things are getting back to some sort of a normal level. So knowing that that's on the table and that's how you plan your strategy now, I think companies are adapting now, are looking for other growth options. Just a larger company, it's a little bit more difficult to jump into a new business model if needed. A smaller company, it's often a little bit easier to try new things, and there are less politics involved. And I think you also know that how it works in those large companies. It's just a little bit slower for them to react, but there are definitely a lot of experiments already ongoing, but just at a small scale.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess as human beings projecting the future, we're always subject to the optimism bias, so it could always be even longer than what people think. But on the recovery from this, I mean, that's one thing, but I recently read Michael Osterholm's book, Deadliest Enemy, which is essentially about viruses, pandemics, and it's the general premise of that book was that we are not ready, and that something like COVID-19 is a warning signal for something that could come down the line. Currently, private sector pharmaceutical companies aren't really incentivized to invest in certain vaccines for products because the business model really doesn't make sense for them. The only way we might have a vaccine is if we have more private public partnerships with big government and large philanthropic organizations investing in this. So, I mean, if this is something that does come around and perhaps bigger and nastier in the future, it would strike me that this is a good opportunity or a good wake-up call for organizations to bake in more integrity into their business models, more adaptability, and so on, so that the next time this inevitably happens, they're ready to respond.
Yeah, correct. As an example, one of the larger logistics companies that we're working with, he also recently explained, I was talking to the strategy director there, and he also pointed out that same thing, like the last few years, many companies, they were just optimized to work as efficient as possible, as with very efficient supply lines from China to Europe, and there was just to optimize the profits and without any redundancy in place. And now you see that in this global crisis, supply chains are being disrupted. There were no parallel distribution lines. They didn't have enough local warehouses or warehouses closer to the European region. So, okay, it's a little bit more cost-effective, less cost-effective to have multiple warehouses in place, to be less optimized, but of course it makes you more redundant if things go wrong. So there are it's one of the first things they're doing now is moving some of their routes to different regions. So if one region falls out for whatever reason, that they have backup lines. And we hear the same thing in many organizations where they're internally, the way they do their production lines, how they work with suppliers. they're already moving in trying to prepare, maybe not purely for pandemic, but just realizing that they're a little bit too vulnerable.
Yeah.
So that's just an operation model. But I also feel that some companies, if you need to move quick and need to find new growth options, still a lot of companies don't have that structure in place to experiment and to learn, to try new offerings. And if you need to do that scratch in a crisis, then you still need to learn all the basics. So at least doing some small experiments, learning how to set it up, what type of people you need to process. So if you need to grow into a new area, that at least you have the experience in-house, that you have the knowledge in-house to move also in that direction. So I think it's a smart move. You need to make companies a little bit more adaptive or agile, if you want. If it's for a pandemic or for another crisis, I think there will be more crises coming up in the next few years. Anyhow, I think it would be a good investment for companies to move in that direction.
Definitely. And it's an interesting paradox where organizations find a winning business model, put in processes and policies around executing on that business model, becoming really efficient at it. But then suddenly the world changes and you're efficient at the wrong thing. Your strength becomes a weakness overnight. And even when it comes to the pandemics, I mean, we've made so much progress over the last, say, 120 years in terms of humanity moving forward across so many different domains. But at the same time, that leaves us vulnerable to viruses moving very, very quickly across these international supply chains and everything else, leaving us vulnerable again. So it's an interesting paradox. But in your low touch economy report, you've profiled many organizations who are adapting in different ways, and you've got companies in here like Shopify, Peloton, Beyond Meat. Are there any that you can talk to around how they are responding to this pandemic?
Yeah, neat. Also last few days now, we just released a new leaderboard with winners. So just keeping track keeping track on which companies are doing better. I mean, overall, you see a couple of clusters emerging. You see that, of course, the pharmaceutical companies, life science companies doing quite well. There's a big cluster there. They're, of course, benefiting from a medical crisis.
Yeah.
Okay, we're focusing less on that domain because it's just linked to the pandemic itself. What's more interesting for me is to see which other clusters are now growing. And also here you see a couple of groups. So you have a lot of IT service companies, companies that are providing the backends of our society now. And so that's, of course, Zoom is the most well-known example, but you see a lot of cybersecurity services that are growing. People are working from home. So there are new sort of networks that need to be secured. So that's interesting to follow. You see sort of what I would call sort of escaping from reality cluster. So anything linked to entertainment, gaming, but even gambling is for me in that corner. You see the gambling companies are doing quite well. People are, even gambling, you have the real gambling like online casinos and those things, but even a service like Robinhood. So people are moving to the stock market via mobile app almost to play along. You see a big rise of people that were not used to do online investments, but they use the same product now also as a sort of entertainment product, so to keep track. And for me, it also fits a little bit in the gambling industry because it attracts a new type of audience. So those are clusters that are emerging. But another group, and we identified a couple of them, but there's what I would call virtual creativity enablers. So it's companies like Adobe, but even NVIDIA, 3D scanning companies. There are a lot of players that are supporting the creative industry, but from a digital perspective, that are also growing. So, and then maybe the last big cluster, and that's it's very noticeable. You see if you need to support low-touch living, so working from home, you need e-commerce to deliver at home. You need food, a lot of e-commerce services, delivery services. So anything that links to making it convenient for people to work remote, to live remote. Those are the well-known players like Just Eat and Amazon and all of those players. So those are different areas that are growing. And then within each of those clusters, there are separate companies that are thriving, that are very swift now to move to make adaptations or adaptations to their business model. But probably the first winners that we see in the first few months, they were already prepared to a certain level. So they didn't start from scratch. So the front runners now did already make changes the last few years. Mm-hmm. So even a company like One Peloton, they exist for several years already. They just happened to be in the right spot already. They had a virtual fitness service, so people can exercise at home with a very expensive bike. But people are already using that product, but it was perfectly designed to fit this area. What's interesting as well is that those companies like Peloton, they were not sitting still. They realized there's a great opportunity, so they're now moving to a lower tier market segment by making instead of normally you would need to buy an expensive bike from them, I think $2,000 or $3,000, but now they're also moving to offer a digital service on Apple TV to make it more accessible, to have a low-end entry point for their service. So although they're already riding that wave and they're sitting in a good position, they're at the same time adapting their offering to even be relevant to a bigger client audience. And that's also interesting to follow, that they're not just sitting still, but also using this opportunity now to grow even faster.
Definitely. And it's interesting on entertainment in particular. I know Netflix has obviously rode this wave. Disney TV doubled its subscriber base, I think, in the first couple of months of the pandemic. But then on the flip side, you had companies like Quibi, which Jeffrey Katzenberg founded. He raised like $1.7 billion for that. I think initially he thought that everybody's going to be at home and therefore Quibi will become popular overnight, but it's absolutely flopped. But I think that's more so just a matter of not reading the market and, short form video. There are so many alternatives out there, like YouTube and TikTok and everything else, but it's just interesting. So in some cases, like you said, with, Peloton, Shopify, these companies are already somewhat well placed. There has been some adapting going on. But did you come across, have you come across examples of organizations who perhaps weren't ready in the sense that their business model wasn't really conducive to thriving in this current market, but have adapted to something new and have found some success with that? Yeah,
a good company that I've been following now for a while is probably not a well-known company, but it's like ME Controls. And what they do, they have specific machines like snow cannons in ski resorts. So that's the type of machinery and tooling they provide. But of course, the ski resorts were already impacted here in Europe. One of the biggest outbreaks was in the different ski regions in Italy and so on. So if you're providing services or products for that type of business, they're impacted quite a lot. But what they did now, they moved that product line to a new product line. So the same machines that are normally producing snow on a slope are now producing disinfectant in large open areas. So they can blow, instead of snow, they can blow disinfectant in large areas. So if you have a factory floor to disinfect or maybe event hall or something. So that's, I think, a very smart pivot from a business that's completely impacted as ski resorts, and it will not be the same the end of the year as well, to a new growth area where a lot of businesses need to adapt to make their spaces more safe, and then they're moving into the right direction. So I think that was those type of shifts that they often happen in the back end, and not many people know those type of companies. But I always admire those type of entrepreneurs where they see an opportunity, move from one area to the other. It's not a type of business like Amazon, but those B2B type of organizations are doing very great things now.
Definitely. And I actually visited a whiskey distillery here in Melbourne on the weekend, and they actually launched their own line of branded hand sanitizer for a little while demand for their product, they basically couldn't sell whiskey for a little while. The bar wasn't open. Now, initially that worked, but obviously now I'm not sure what it's like in Belgium, but the market is completely saturated with hand sanitizer. Yes. McDonald's is selling it. So now they need to adapt to something else. But I guess the lesson there is just being adaptable enough to try something, but not overcommit. Like you say, experiment, but be prepared to move to something else if it's not working.
Yeah. So those type of examples, there's a lot of stuff happens in that space where companies move to mask making or sanitizer. In our list, we didn't track those type of companies, assuming that many of those things will be very temporary, just for a couple of months. So you probably won't see a lot of those companies in our, let's say, our top 50 that we currently have online.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I mean, on the winners that you have been tracking, I mean, other than say sort of technological infrastructure and whatnot, I mean, are there any sort of characteristics that define them in terms of their organizational culture or leadership is concerned?
Probably the companies that are doing best are those companies that already had a sort of a digital transformation mindset. So they were, it's basically an extension of that ongoing trend. So it's not totally new. So companies that were already designed with that in mind. They already had the right people in house. There's some assets. They're in the best position now to grow. So the first winners now that we see this year are probably those companies that already had this digital mindset in house. Companies that need to adapt now, need to switch to this new area. I think that's probably the most challenging. But there are areas where let's say that digital thinking or the digital mindset was not really present, but that are now making great leaps. So for me, companies in the legal space are interesting to track because legal traditionally there's still a lot of paperwork involved, very regulated markets, people with a lot of sometimes with old-fashioned mindsets towards business thinking. In order to keep their business up and running, they had to switch to digital tools, but they realized, I think, in many areas that it creates so much extra convenience. You see courts moving to a video, remote conferencing, scheduling tools. So a lot of practical document management. So they had to switch, and in order to make. And what's interesting here is that because they were forced to switch to digital tools, they also had to remove some of the big barriers, like changing regulation that is officially allowed for legally to do court rulings via Zoom or those things. So they had to change hurdles or barriers from a legal point of view that probably never would have happened, or maybe that maybe would normally take another 10 years to do so because it was never a clear priority. But now they took that away, those barriers. And we assume that many of those changes will now stick in the legal industry. So although maybe those type of business are not yet in the first top 50 companies, I think the legal industry as a whole, and there are a couple of other those traditional industries, they will now accelerate quite fast because you just move. You take away some of the big barriers like legal work and regulation. If that's away, now you can actually use all those new tools and benefits, and people will adapt, like that convenience, and will probably not go back to the old way of working.
Definitely, and legal services is an interesting one because tools, whether it's contract review, automation, and things of that persuasion, have been around now for a number of years. Some law firms do use them, top tier firms, but really adoption has been slow and more so confined to, say, legal tech startups. So I guess we're seeing, in general, the adoption of certain technologies that have been around for a number of years just become sort of accelerated during this pandemic and taken on by, say, laggard larger organizations who perhaps were anchored to certain ways of doing things that were familiar to them.
Yes. But it's not because it's being used a lot that it will stick, because that's what we assume that not with a lot of tools because it also needs to fit within the right context. So if you would look at home education, and we had a lot of talking already and research on that field, because in most regions people had their kids at home suddenly, and schools had to switch to remote schooling. But at the same time, you see that society, and I assume it's the same in your region, are as soon as possible switching back, that kids can go back to school, that's definitely the younger kids. So that also means that those tools, it might have been a temporary solution, but I don't think there will be a significant shift now that, let's say from next year on, kids from 14 years old suddenly will be home and their parents will still help them out with school. So maybe for universities and colleges, there will be some acceleration going on. But for the younger kids, I think that would be a very temporary thing. I think many regions will try to avoid that. They go back to the very strict lockdowns. So keeping kids in schools is probably the best option to also make sure that everybody can still go to work as well, because so parents don't need to take care of them. So all the tools and business that are supporting homeschooling will not flourish as many people have believed that it would happen.
Yeah.
It's not a universal thing that any tool will by definition now will grow now.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, especially with schools. I mean, schools essentially started out as a form of childcare, if you will, 100 years ago, right? So parents need to go to work and earn money, and even if that's working from home, I mean, it's difficult if your kids are home pulling on your pants all day long. So that's become a challenge for a lot of people working from home. But also the social element of children going to school and learning how to conduct
indeed,
build relationships, like that's difficult to replicate from home. So in your report, you talk about quick wins as well as longer term opportunities. Now, with respect to, say, short term opportunities, like we've covered a couple, and you've mentioned organizations who are just looking for some form of short term revenue. I mentioned the whiskey distillery, which definitely wouldn't figure in the top 50 companies, just a temporary solution. But I mean, what can organizations do to perhaps generate some shorter term revenue while they try to figure out where they're going to shift their business model to?
Yeah, there are a couple of different approaches here. If you need to move in different space, we often advise to try to stick to your existing client segment, because it's always very difficult to attract a new type of audience, to build up new relationships. That really takes time. Even if today, if it's difficult to serve your clients with your product that you currently have, it's easy. I always believe that it's easier to switch to an adjacent product for the same client than to take your existing product to a new type of client. So that's another direction. So the go-to strategy would be to explore, stick to your existing client segment, but try to find new problems, new needs, or adjacent problems, and see if you can actually solve it in a slightly different way. Maybe partner with another company to do something like that. That would be the first area to explore. Then, unfortunately, see how do you find those problems? So how do you find those needs? An interesting approach that I often like is that to see, can you spot areas where your clients or your users today are improvising? Is that you see that a lot now with people during lockdowns, or when we're disconnected now, or working from remotely. Many people use some existing tools. They use maybe some game communication platforms to interact with their families. Suddenly, they use Zoom conference calls to do yoga classes. So people just use the tools that are available, but then maybe adapt them and improvise with them for a totally new use case. We've seen examples where people are using Zoom for babysitting, Zoom for weddings. Those tools were never designed for that use case. So if you see that people are improvising and just trying to figure it out, that's sometimes a good opportunity to see, maybe we can optimize and create a better solution, or maybe create a new workflow to accommodate for that. So spotting new behaviors, see how people improvise, that's a good way to spot opportunities. If you can't stick to your existing client base, basically, because sometimes, of course, that's also not possible. That could not be possible. You might need to explore a completely new space as well to find new problems and new growth areas. And I think the opportunity today is that the good thing about this global crisis is the fact that it's global in itself. That means that there are regions globally that you can track and see how other companies are solving very similar problems. So normally you don't have that situation. Like we are based in Europe, we can already see what's happening in Southeast Asia, what our companies maybe in Northern Africa are doing, what's happening in the LATAM region. So everybody's impacted in a very similar way. But that also means that, let's say, even if you're in a restaurant business, hospitality, there are literally thousands of experiments ongoing. How do you serve clients today? What type of business pivots can you make in that space? And it's not just a couple of examples. If you look around, every region now has similar problems. So you can probably mix and match existing ideas that are happening already in different regions, and then adapt that to your own culture or your own context. So there's also an opportunity. The fact that there are so many people experimenting at the same time creates the opportunity to also copy from those regions.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, copying from other regions is something that we do in the best of times, but now perhaps you can get a leg up against the competition by just being really honed in on what's happening overseas and spotting those opportunities that perhaps haven't made their way to your shores just yet. Another thing I found was that, you talk about this feedback loop earlier and the ripple effects on people's behaviors and so on. Obviously now with food delivery, people eating in a lot more, that lends itself to new business opportunities. I think you say in your report, new habits can influence new business opportunities. So when I think about food delivery, I just think, well, instead of a restaurant, maybe having a dark kitchen where you don't have the wait staff, you don't have the commercial lease on a restaurant and cleaning and everything else, but you might have a dark kitchen, which is just renting out an industrial kitchen somewhere, and you're on the food delivery apps and it's just food production and delivery. But through that, you get to test lots of different cuisines and brands and whatnot through the apps. And then should the economy reopen, well, then perhaps you've got some data with which you can decide if you want to start a full-blown restaurant or just continue in the app. But I guess there's so many different habits that people are forming now that do lend themselves to these new opportunities.
Yeah, indeed. And maybe stick like the dark kitchens. I think it's an interesting move because again, this is something that was happening already for a couple of years, but now this is, was a great solution now in these times to, instead of using the same restaurants, going to maybe to the suburbs or the outer parts of the city, then using low cost industrial areas to build local kitchens there for food delivery. What interesting is that was another example from a business and what they do, they basically they use existing restaurants, but then they reserve a small spot in that restaurant for a virtual brand. So they have their own food production, so they just need a fridge in that restaurant, maybe it's a fryer and maybe 2 plates. But then if you order online, you order that it's being produced in another restaurant, just in a corner of another existing restaurant. And so restaurants that had to close or that were restricted could maybe monetize or tap into that need. So I have a couple of other brands using their kitchen, so they can still deliver, but then with other menus. So they basically they rent out a part of their own kitchen for another food delivery service. So you see all those experiments, ongoing variations of dark kitchens and virtual kitchens and all that. And the good thing is if there's if business owners are experimenting with that, if it helps them, it creates new client relationships, it creates more profit. Again, later on, they probably will keep part of that service. They will not go back to normal table service with just 10 clients, a couple of tables. If they see they can at the same time still serve better via food delivery apps or whatever, they probably stick to a part of that service as well. So they were introduced now to this digital way of working. With digital menus, digital ordering, and they will probably adapt, and part of that service will stick in the future.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And moving away from shorter term opportunities to long term opportunities, as you put it in the report, new white spaces. You've got here examples of triggers that people can use to identify these new opportunities. So, for example, claiming a new vertical in a growing industry, such as Zoom for dating. I guess we've kind of touched on that a little bit there with, just looking at workarounds, like how are people using existing tools to identify, how are people using existing tools in a way that is essentially a workaround, and that then lends itself to perhaps coming up with a completely new business model. Is there anything else that you suggest leaders or innovators should be looking at in terms of identifying longer term opportunities?
Yeah. So for us, the 3 main clusters to track here are the most visible one are the changes in consumer habits. But I think there's a lot of being written already about that part. But there's 2 second areas. The follow-up area for us is anything linked to industry shifts. So you see players that are let's say they were impacted in one field, they're now moving to another field. So if you have a practical example, we work together with Zalando, online fashion e-commerce player. Overall fashion was impacted quite severely. People were not buying as many clothes. If you're not going out, if you're not dating, if not so people are not buying clothes enough. But at the same time, a player like Zalando, it's a perfect designed digital business. So they have everything in place to move in a lot of different areas. So I think large companies need to pay close attention to those type of businesses because they're in the perfect position. They have all the skills in-house to they have people with a digital mindset, they have digital assets, they have the technology in-house. So if they are now in an industry that's impacted, like fashion is impacted today, and they feel the pressure, they might suddenly move into your space as well. So you need to keep an eye on those type of companies that are maybe in the travel business, hospitality, maybe fashion even, that are impacted, but have the right skills in-house to move into a new space. So that's interesting to follow. And the third topic, I already referred to that as well. That's anything that links to changes in regulation. That's again, that's maybe not less sexy. It's not about a new VR technology or whatever, but if you take away legal barriers or hurdles, that suddenly can open up a lot of new markets. Like we work with several insurer companies. They're operating a complete market that's heavily regulated. There are a lot of rules to follow, but governments are now changing how they can operate because basically insurers hold the key to open up the economy again. If they would not insure tourism, then tourism will not exist in the next few months. Mm-hmm. So they're making changes to how insurers can operate. But of course, that again will have ripple effects because if tourism can recover, but uncertain, with following certain guidelines to lower the risk, then maybe new companies need to help out to manage that risk. You need new planning tools, you need new services to help to safely open up the economy again. So by tracking what's happening in regulation, you can see how it creates a ripple effect in other parts of society. Mm-hmm. And that again could be an opportunity for you as well to move into that space. Like I said, it's less sexy. People like to talk more about digital technology and VR and whatever's happening in that space. But I don't believe that the technology in this crisis is the main driver. It's more about changes in the supply chain, change in regulation, a little bit less sexy, but more fundamental and with a bigger impact today.
Yeah, no, that all makes a lot of sense. And I think, in regulation, you might have instances where health authorities might look to fast track, say, the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials for certain vaccine experiments, which may lower the barriers to entry, for example, for biosciences companies and things of that persuasion. Although I know in America, the FDA is definitely not making such concessions as yet, which is interesting. But this has been a fascinating conversation. I mean, we've only really touched, skimmed the surface of your report. I mean, it is a 102-page report on the low-touch economy, short-term wins, long-term wins, what characterizes organizations, what companies can do to adapt and pivot their business model. They can pick that up over at the lowtoucheconomy.com. Are there any other resources you'd like to point our listeners to, Nick?
Probably that's a good starting point. We keep we every couple of days or weeks we publish new reports or new frameworks to help out because it's probably this low touch economy will be here to stay for quite some time now. If people just go to lowtoucheconomy.com, that's probably the best starting point to follow this topic. Perfect.
And if they want to connect with yourself, where's the best place?
Probably LinkedIn is still the best way to reach out to me. So if you're just Nick De Mey on LinkedIn or maybe Nick De Mey on Twitter, that's a good starting point. But probably you can share it in the notes as well on the recording.
Definitely. We'll add both lowtoucheconomy.com and your LinkedIn profile to the show notes. Nick, this has been an awesome conversation. Thank you so much for your time, and also thank you so much for your work in this space. From the outside looking in, it looks absolutely tireless. You guys are putting out a lot of great work, a lot of great thought leadership. So thank you.
Yes, great. Thanks for the conversation.
Hi guys, Steve again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to receive a weekly email from me, complete with reflections, books I've been reading, words of wisdom, and access to blogs, ebooks, and more that I'm publishing on a regular basis, just leave your details at futuresquared.xyz/subscribe and you'll receive the very next one. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, take a minute to like, share, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It goes a long way to giving the podcast the exposure it needs so I can continue bringing you guests and conversations of the highest caliber. You can catch me on Twitter at Steve Glaveski and on Instagram at @TheSteveGlaveski. Until next time.
Hasta la vista, baby.
This has been a No Filter Media production.
Say what you want.